This is Dan Proft coming to you with another edition of Against the Current. We're coming to you from Freedom Summit, AM 560's annual conference, conservative thought leaders and intellectuals. And we're pleased to have on this edition a thought leader, an intellectual, a distinguished soldier, Colonel Oliver North. Colonel North.
Good to see you, Dan.
Pleasure. Thanks for being with us.
A little scary, that kind of an introduction.
I'm sure
my wife and kids are going to see this as intellectual. Are you kidding? Yeah.
So before, and by the way, the new book, Heroes Proved, Oliver North also, I failed to mention it, best-selling author. Heroes Proved is the new book, and we're going to get to that. But I want to start, since you once upon a time ran for Senate in the great state of Virginia, what your assessment is of the results in Virginia, not so much even the governor's race, but particularly Democrats virtually flipping the House of Delegates from a supermajority to a...
Here we are doing this on Veterans Day. We still don't know the outcome of 3 or 4 races down there. Dramatic
seismic shift, though.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt. Look, Virginia's been one of the fastest growing states until right now. I don't know what's going to happen after this, but there's no doubt that a lot of the Northeast brought their liberal thinking when they came down to get good jobs. And it was enough to carry it dramatically from what we've been familiar with. Virginia's been a Republican state, certainly hardcore for at least a quarter of a century. It began to go purple here in the last couple of elections because we've had a Democrat governor. We're going to have a Democrat regime in Richmond, there's no doubt about it. And it was stunning. My wife's an election official out in Clark County, which is a tiny little part. She came home and said, no doubt it's going to Republican sweep. And I said, watch this. And in fact, it turned out to be just exactly what they predicted, given the counts. And they've done some very, very good polling. Ed Gillespie's organization, you'd think a guy who'd been the head of the RNC was going to carry it. Now, thank God that's not my beat.
Yeah.
Politics are not my beat, but it was shocking.
But Virginia is such an important state in presidentials. Now, it didn't go for Trump, and he still won. But are we seeing a Virginia that is reacting to Trump, plus the off-year, essentially off-year election for Virginia and New Jersey, the party out of power, and just the nature of that? Or is there kind of something else afoot, or is a confluence of a multitude of factors?
As you and I know, Dan, our colleagues in the mainstream media who cover politics have all said this is a dramatic repudiation of Donald Trump. I think less so in Virginia than the effectiveness of their organization on the ground, the effectiveness of a camp. Look at the new governor is not going to be a screaming leftist in the likes of Hillary Clinton or Bernie
Terry
Sanders.
McAuliffe.
Or Terry McAuliffe, the bag man for Bill Clinton. Right? We elected him in Virginia.
Yeah.
I didn't, but
right.
Yeah. So I don't think this is necessarily a predictor of the way things are going to turn out in 2018 or even 2020. There is no doubt the Republican organization needs to get their act together.
I want to talk about veterans on this Veterans Day that we're sitting down and chatting. And you made some remarks earlier in the day today at this Freedom Summit conference, and I just want you to kind of reprise those because I think people need to hear them. What you think Veterans Day has unfortunately become, the unfortunate part of what Veterans Day has become.
Yeah. When I was a kid, it was Armistice Day because the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month was the end of World War I. And there were still a lot of those veterans around when I was a kid. It then became Veterans Day. Now it's Mattress Sale Day and Ford Car Day and Chevy Car Day and the rest of it. Unfortunately, we're in a cultural time when less than 1% of the American people even know the name of somebody currently serving, and they may remember the name of a veteran who might have served once. The 16.5 million men and women who served in World War II are passing from us. I spent last night at a service up in New York. There were 48 veterans of World War II. I've not seen that many in one place in a long time, and we're not going to see them for much longer.
Yeah.
What we need to realize is that was the greatest generation that won World War II. Those who have fought in this war are the best and bravest of this generation. And what we've stopped doing is we've stopped reminding people why they came. Our educational system, our colleagues in the mainstream media, our entertainment people, they don't even put up the shots of what happened on 9/11/01. They'll show you maybe a movie about some heroic SEAL or a Marine or a soldier or whatever, but there's none of the input as to why they came and volunteered to serve, knowing they were going to go to a war. This is the first generation that's been all volunteers in our armed forces since the American Revolution. It's the first generation that's gone off when they came into the service, knowing there was about a 99% opportunity for them to go to a war because our military is so much smaller than it's been. We have to be able to recruit the best and bravest and brightest of the next generation. And we need 175,000, at minimum, high school graduates who are going to join the military this year, in the next 12 months. Otherwise, you start to draw down on those who made 8, 9, 10 commitments, overseas deployments. Horrifically difficult for the families.
What about an assessment of where the military is these days? It's not insulated from the larger culture, the larger political dynamics, and we've seen some real head scratchers in the last few years, from the report that the shooting in Fort Hood was workplace violence to this week in the run-up to Veterans Day, as one WMPT Marine put it on Fox and Friends, a Army deserter getting a $300,000 signing bonus to join the Taliban, talking about Bo Bergdahl.
Yeah.
So what about, is the military leadership being corroded by the larger cultural Marxism that afflicts so many civic institutions?
Look, the Commander-in-Chief has enormous latitude when it comes to affecting, if you will, the military culture. He can order things that the military has to do that the rest of society can't be ordered to do. For example, the whole business about transgendered, the whole business about accepting the idea of, Johnny's going to live with Joe instead of Johnny and Jane. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the culture, there was an enormous effort to use our military in a radical social engineering experiment. And so many of the senior people, like the judge who would say, okay, he served 5 years in a box, Bergdahl, and therefore he doesn't have to serve any more time. They've come up through 8 years of what was going on in that culture. I had the great blessing of working for Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan only had 4 years of Jimmy Carter to undo. This is a major challenge for the Commander-in-Chief to get our military on the kind of trajectory, not only to deter war, most important, win wars if we have to fight them, and be able to recruit the next generation, because there's never been a generation in history, not just our country, that hasn't had to fight. And so recognizing that it's an all-volunteer military, it's going to have to come from the best and the brightest of the next generation. We need to be able to make sure that those people know what the heck they're fighting for.
What's your assessment of those senior military leaders around President Trump, most particularly, I would say, of course, SecDef Mattis and General John Kelly?
Well, I know both of them well. I put General Mattis, then Lieutenant Mattis, through basic. He was, as he puts it, one of my lieutenants. I've known John Kelly well for the last 10 years. I've watched him. I've been with him. He tells a story about how I stole his helicopter on one of my deployments for 5. I didn't. I only borrowed it. But I have enormous admiration for these men. I think the president's chosen some very, very wise, made some very, very wise decisions on those two, as well as General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He could have cleaned house, and he didn't. And so he's listened to some people who understand how important that military leadership is in a world that is truly chaotic. Look, President Trump inherited the New World disorder, okay? The greatest existential threats we face are nuclear-armed Pyongyang and Tehran and the means of delivering nuclear weapons. And they're working together on it. The first person to ever acknowledge that is President Trump, but they've known about it for at least the last 7 years. There's no way that in Korea, where grass is a vegetable you serve in salad, could afford to build nuclear weapons without the help of the Iranians. And so the last administration dumped billions of dollars on the Iranians, that immediately to Hezbollah, Hamas, all the terror organizations, and to their nuclear weapons program. And so as President Trump has repeatedly said, that the deal, they didn't even call it a treaty, the deal that was done in Vienna by Kerry and Obama is about the worst deal in the world you could ever get. So a lot of that has to be fixed. And quite frankly, I think he's got around him the right people to do it. The question is, will the media ever recognize what he's done? Look at this. He's been on a foreign trip now for 6 days, 7 days, and he's done some amazing things. He stood up to the Chinese, which no one has done since Richard Nixon, and pointed at him and said, you're not going to stick it to us anymore. Instead, what do we have on TV? All of our colleagues in the mainstream media are talking about a Senate race down in Alabama.
Right.
And so it's very hard for him to get his message out, other than a handful of guys like you who are going to put it up on the net and people are going to get a chance to see it. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why television is a dying video form.
The existential threats that we face, you mentioned nuclearized Pyongyang, nuclear Tehran. Where does Russian revanchism fit into those existential threats?
Well, the Russians, look, at mutually assured destruction works for the Russians and the Chinese. Why? Because they want to survive the experience. I see no guarantee that that's in the mental cognitive functions of those who govern in Tehran or Pyongyang. In fact, just the opposite is what they normally say. They have a vision of Armageddon. It's apocalyptic. When people have that perspective, mutually assured destruction doesn't work. They're not worried about it. One nuclear weapon going off over the United States will shut down, through an electromagnetic pulse, literally a third of the country, depending on the altitude and the size of the burst. If that happened in February, tens of millions of Americans would die. We have no way of protecting America against that except to prevent them from getting that weapon that they can fire at us.
So Trump, in that foreign policy speech he gave back in the spring, essentially established his doctrine as what he termed principled realism.
Yeah.
Do you think that's kind of a healthy approach to deal with these existential threats, as well as to reassert America's leadership in the world?
It works in places like Eastern Europe, which lived under communism for decades. It works in places like Vietnam. You know, they invited us to come to these conferences, and that's because the Vietnamese are looking at their Chinese neighbors and saying, oh dear, what will we do? Where are our friends going to come from? It doesn't work so well in France or Germany or the Western European powers, in large part because they become so accommodating to the threat.
What about,
and they know that we're the target, they're not.
Well, but what about I think the realism part of the principled realism also is a statement about kind of neocon impulses for state building in places like North Africa and the Middle East.
Well,
and so even though he's made a troop commitment in Afghanistan, is that understanding the limitations of American power when it comes to creating civil society where there is no civil society, is that good foreign policy?
Dan, let me just talk about Afghanistan for a minute. I've spent an inordinate amount of the last 16 years of my life over there. There's no doubt that what we've been trying to accomplish in Afghanistan has failed. I mean, the Taliban controls more territory today than they did last year. It's been that way for 2 or 3 years now. What we must be about is looking at different ways of doing things. There's been a number of proposals. They've not yet worked their way through the bureaucracy in Washington that you could accomplish with a fewer number of American troops without doing the same thing that we've repeatedly done and failed at. Like, how many times have we heard, I'm going to augment the forces over there. We're going to have a surge for X number of people. The only thing that's varied is the numbers and how long they're there for. I'd like to see some other ideas, and some other time when we got more time we can talk about them. I think there is a certain reality that nation building is an incredibly expensive task, and under certain circumstances, we're probably not going to accomplish it. We're not going to bring about a Jeffersonian democracy in Kabul.
We can barely do it in Virginia.
We just failed at it in Virginia. Yeah, and so when you look at it from a realistic perspective, what can you do? We've got American troops in Africa today, special operations troops, not combat troops. Mm-hmm. We've been doing that around the world now since World War II, and it works. It doesn't always work just exactly the way it should. We lost 4 great Americans on an operation lately, and of course in the midst of that, the president gets pinged for why are they there? Well, because we have interests in Africa not becoming a haven for ISIS. And it's not just ISIS. It's Al-Qaeda. It's Boko Haram. It's Hezbollah, Al-Shabaab, you name it, okay? Doesn't matter the trade name. They're all part of the same franchise, killing infidels and dying to do it. And that's not an existential threat, but it's certainly disruptive.
On a more uplifting note on this Veterans Day, obviously, in addition to the book, Heroes Proved, you have war stories on Fox News, and you tell great stories about great American fighting men and women. And so maybe a favorite war story of yours on this Veterans Day.
Well, I grew up in I'm an old man now. I grew up with a father who was a World War II hero, and uncles and people I knew well who served in World War II and Korea in both, in some cases. My father and my uncles influenced me and all of my brothers to serve. when you look at what happens as a consequence of that service, you keep company with heroes. I grew up with heroes. I still do. And the greatest blessing I've had is that Fox lets me continue to do so. Not quite as quick as I used to be. And one of the favorite things that ever happened to me out there is I'm running in the midst of a gunfight and a Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant.
This is where?
And this was in Ramadi, Iraq in 2007. And my cameraman and I are both dive into a puddle full of stuff you probably not want to have near your home. And his comment was, if you hadn't used the expletive, because these are guys who could take vulgarity to the level of a new art form, we'd still be using it on Fox, because you can hear him say, bleeping amazing how fast an old man can move when he's properly motivated. So I've had this incredible experience of the requirement that we had for Fox News war stories in 102 episodes now. A lot more than, by the way, a certain young guy with a page boy haircut. Ken Burns. Sorry, Ken, this is not your show. I've had the opportunity to keep company with them, to let them tell their stories. 102 hours of it now, 60 embeds overseas. And it's a great blessing because I get inspired every time I sit down. I got these guys on camera in these gunfights and then hear them say things like, all I wanted to do was save that little girl. And these are Americans. And you see that kind of thing happen every day. It gives you inspiration. We can still, as a country, produce these remarkable heroes who are there not for gold or oil or colonial conquest. They do it to protect us here at home and offer others the hope of freedom. It's a wonderful opportunity.
Since you brought up Ken Burns, what about his series on the Vietnam War, since he's such a celebrated documentarian? The feedback I get most often, and I agree with it, from Vietnam veterans is this idea that the Viet Cong were the superior fighting force, they were the superior fighting man, they were more clever, the American soldier was essentially an inferior soldier, and this was part of the problems. It wasn't a strategic problem. It wasn't a problem of civilian political authority decision making. He almost, in some aspects of his series, puts the blame at an overmatched armed forces, the U.S. being overmatched with respect to the Viet Cong.
Ken Burns failed all of us who served in that war. He failed the Gold Star moms who lost a son. He failed the widows who lost their husbands. He failed the orphans who lost their dad. We won every battle. We didn't lose the war. Richard Nixon, who was disparaged in Ken Burns' documentary, is given the onus of responsibility for what there was of it, and the American fighting man was derided as a pot-headed marauder. The Marines that served with me and the soldiers that served with my brother were American heroes. Many of them were drafted. Very few of the draftees had to go to the war. And so the youngsters that I had the great blessing of commanding in the field went with me to places where, and under circumstances that they could only be called heroes. Now, officers always get more medals than they deserve, and the troops very rarely get the recognition they want, but not one single Marine that I commanded, and according to my brother, not one single soldier he commanded, was ever a pothead. They didn't smoke crack or toke up out in the field. I would look at that vision that he created as one of the most disfiguring portrayals of American bravery you could possibly come up with.
Now, fast forwarding to another aspect of your career, just thinking about this in 2017, obviously you mentioned serving for President Reagan and being part of the brain trust that was up against the evil empire at the end of the Cold War. And your role in that, in also involving yourself in satellites of the evil empire, like Daniel Ortega's El Salvador. And to think about it now, 30 years forward, where you have the New York Times doing a exhaustive retrospective on the Red Century, where they and I just had this conversation with Dinesh D'Souza too, where they gloss over the fact that 60 million people were murdered at the hands of that totalitarian regime. and frankly, in El Salvador, Daniel Ortega coming back to power these many years later. Nicaragua, excuse me.
Well, look, first of all, Ronald Reagan's no longer with us. Ronald Reagan's goal I joined the administration in July of 1981, so he's been in office at that point for 5 months, and very quickly learned that the preeminent focus of his tenure in office was going to be the destruction of the evil empire, not through nuclear weapons, but making sure that they couldn't threaten us with theirs, with economically breaking their back, with denying them their satellites, and he did. And so if you look at a president who was able to accomplish his goals, that was probably the most important thing that's happened in the 20th century, because the wreckage of what communism had, which, as you point out very accurately, totally glossed over in both the Washington Compost and the New York Crimes, right? And so when you look at what he accomplished, and it didn't all happen, of course, the day he left office, but by a year later, it's all coming unraveled. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire was gone. The Chinese were put back in their box. The idea of an advance, 22 countries under Jimmy Carter went to some form of revolution to include Iran and to include most of Latin America and much of Africa. 22 countries in 4 years. All that stopped. Made the world a safer place for my kids. I got 17 grandkids. I look at those youngsters today and I know they're in a safer world because we went from tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, which God forbid would ever detonate in this country, gone, right? And a new respect brought forth, even though the Europeans rioted madly when we put the Patriot missiles over there to stop the Soviets from putting more missiles in Eastern Europe, that whole evil empire is gone. And so Vladimir Putin might want to try to resurrect the Tsarist empire. Never happened.
And no regrets or reflections on kind of the state of Central America, what you see in South America and in countries that are disintegrating like Venezuela, and this battle. I mean, Reagan said it requires eternal vigilance, but this battle against totalitarian states, against socialism and communism, socialism in a hurry, that rages on 30 years after it looked like we had relegated into the ash heap.
I can accept that, except for one thing. No one who ever watched what happened on 9/11/01, starting at 8:05 in the morning, can ever say we dropped the ball. Okay, America was never attacked like that before. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, was only remotely, tiny bit worse than what happened in New York on a farmer's field in Pennsylvania at the Pentagon. We'd never been attacked that way before. To the extent that that's distracted us from those other things, certainly it has. It's cost a treasure. It's cost us the lives of over 7,000 young Americans. There's 34,000 of them that are very seriously injured that we need to take better care of, the veterans who've lost limbs. But the reality of it is the rest of the world has not gone to hell in a handbasket. Venezuela's upside down. Daniel Ortega's back in charge in Nicaragua. But you know what? They're never going to spread a revolution without frontiers like the Ortegas originally intended to do. The situation in Cuba where they've been blasting our diplomats with Lord knows what, some kind of sonic weapon, that is eventually going to change. The last of the Castros is watching the end of communism on that island. Vietnam, where we won all the battles but still lost the war, Vietnam is going to become an ally of the United States. Yeah. You've seen the Japanese, for the first time since 1945, consider we may need to arm ourselves and do a better job of protecting ourselves, in large part because what President Trump has said. We're going to help you, but we're not going to be alone in this. And so I look at this with some degree of optimism. The evil empire is dead. Communist socialism, Leninism, whatever one wants to call it, is finished. Putin couldn't get away with it. The Chinese certainly aren't practicing the Marxist model of an economy. What you've got are dictatorships in both cases. You've got oligarchs. But in fact, my grandchildren are better off because of what Ronald Reagan did. And my hope is you can continue that on without breaking the bank and without putting Americans at risk unduly.
Speaking of your grandchildren, I want to close with how you prepare them for the world, the three things in box that
should've
each one of
brought-
your grandchildren
Should have
gets.
brought them with me. I give them at their 14th birthday. I give them. I get 10 boys and 7 girls so far, and I'm actually hoping for 2 evenly matched baseball teams. We're working on it.
Yeah, there you go.
But I give them a box, and on the box is a note that says, "If you learn to use all 3 things in this box, you'll never go hungry, you'll never be lost, and you need fear nothing." And they open the box, and they find inside the box a Holy Bible, and tucked into the Bible is the Constitution. They find a lensatic compass and a map, and they find a 20-gauge shotgun. And of course, the first thing they want to use is the shotgun,
Not the compass?
not the compass.
Yeah.
And of course, it just happens. I don't believe in coincidences, you might imagine. It just happens that there are 31 proverbs, and it's probably the best guidance a young person. In fact, they're written for a young person. Solomon wrote them for his sons, and but they're equally important for, particularly the Proverbs 31, to women especially. So I said that today's the 11th of November. Come back and see me on the 10th of December and give me a book report. And then if I'm satisfied with that, I'll teach them how to use the compass and the map, because we live in topography where you can actually see the topo lines
Okay.
and the west slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains along the Shenandoah River. And then I'll teach them how to take apart the shotgun, put it back together, clean it, and then how to shoot it. So they'll never be hungry, they'll never be lost, and they need fear nothing.
And they'll, be on their sporting clays trap skeet shooting team in high school or whatever.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. He is Colonel Oliver North. The book, Heroes Proved, of course, War Stories on Fox News Channel as well. Colonel North, pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, safe travels.
That was fun.
Godspeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.